Hello again, whiskey friends. Thanks for joining everybody for another whiskey review. And today we are going to be talking about the Penelope 15-year light whiskey coming in at 128 proof. We're going to have a few things to say about this one. Some things positive, some things not so positive. But by the end of this review, I'll let you know if this is something that you should be looking out for. So thank you for joining me today, whiskey friends. Let's kick off the show. All right. So I got a little bit poured there for today's tasting. And as we go through this, if you are not familiar, here I'll do a little zoom in on the bottle for you. Here is the Penelope 15-year light whiskey. You can see what this label looks like. They do have different iterations of this. So this is specifically the 15-year. I know they've come out of other variations over the course of the last couple of years, but we are talking about the 15-year. And if you aren't familiar with the term light whiskey, it is a different classification of whiskey. Predominantly, it is a corn whiskey. I believe the mash bill on this one is 99% corn, 1% malted barley. And then the other big differences that differentiate this from bourbon is the fact that it was aged in a used barrel. Thus, at 15 years, you can kind of see this amber color versus a dark color that you'd expect from a bourbon. And it can also be distilled at a higher proof, between 160 and 190. And then a lot of the times that results in some of these light whiskeys coming out even hazmat because of where they're able to distill it. So that's a little preview there of light whiskey. And when it comes with Penelope, I was excited about this one. I'll pull up the stats here in just a moment. But coming off the Penelope 9-year bourbon that really impressed me last year, I was excited to dive into another new Penelope product. And this is the first one I found. We'll go through that though. There are some highlights on this one, and there are some things to keep an eye on. So let's pull out the stats. So this light whiskey did cost $120. We are going to talk about the price quite a bit at the end of this, and also talk about some light whiskey alternatives that you can get at a cheaper price. The proof, as I mentioned earlier, was 128.4, and it is age stated at 15 years old. Well, let's get into the flavor notes here. We're going to walk through the nose, walk through the palate, and then get into the final thoughts. Cheers, whiskey friends. Thanks for joining me this far. So, one thing to keep in mind, I think this just applies to all light whiskeys in general, but you are typically talking about something that is extremely sweet and extremely palatable. The 99% corn whiskey essentially creates that. You don't have any rye spice in there. It is just all about candy like flavors. Now, on this particular one, the 15 years does emerge with this nice rich oak that I really appreciate. I get a bit of praline, and then for the most part, get a lot of coffee cake. So, if you aren't familiar with coffee cake, we're talking about a dense cake, maybe even a pound cake that's got some cinnamon, got some good sweetness to it. Something that you'd have in the morning goes really, really well with coffee. It's got the sugar crumble on top of it. Or in this case, I am equating some of that to the praline. Fruit wise, I get it a little in the background on the nose. I think I'll get it more predominantly as we go through the palate, but there is a little bit of a bright peach as well. Well, I think that describes the nose for the most part. Let's get into the palate. Cheers, everybody. Hmm. Extremely rich, extremely oily. You can kind of see it run down my glass here. You can see the oils in this thing coming from that cask. And you just feel that each step of the way. It is very, very soothing and pleasant from a mouthfeel experience. Really love the mouthfeel. And it actually packs a whole lot of flavor initially up front, generally aligned with the flavor notes that I said at the beginning of this with the nose, thinking about that cinnamon, thinking about that brown sugar, that coffee cake, and a little bit of that peaches, less of that praline sensation. Let's get into mid palate. By mid palate, the sweetness factor just goes up tenfold. I'd equate it to a butterscotch, but not a butterscotch syrup that you would be putting on ice cream. More like the butterscotch syrup that you're pumping into a coffee. If you think about those, those canisters where you can pump the sweeteners into your coffee, and not like the artificial sweetener one, not the zero sugar one, like the real sweet sugary one. Beyond that, though, there aren't a whole lot of flavors. That peach does pop up mid palate as well, so that at least evens it out a little bit. But for the most part, you're just going to be overwhelmed by the sweetness, and that might be something that's attractive to you. But I'm usually looking for a bit more depth. That's the difference here that you see on the screen. Flavor, really enjoying it right now, but depth, there's not a lot to chew on. It's just, oh man, it's making me pucker. It's so sweet. Once again, that butterscotch syrup, I do think is a good note there to think about. So then going to the finish on this one, same flavors again, but they do start to diminish. But even though the volume on the flavors does diminish, the length of the finish, probably due to that oiliness, does extend, and you're just left with that peach and vanilla, essentially peaches and cream, working its way through. Still tasting it right now, and it's been quite a bit since I've had that last sip. So that walks through the scores there. As you can see, for the most part, flavor wise, it's good. Doesn't have a lot of depth. It does some good things on the technical end. So then, in terms of the balance, did give it a 7 out of 10. Debated between a 7 and an 8. Ultimately, ended up at a 7 just because I the lack of depth in this profile. I've seen other brands find depth and add depth in there in various ways. So comparatively to other brands, that's where I pulled it back on the balance a little bit. And then it comes down to the value at $120 for this product. It does make it tough because when I think about it against some of my single barrels coming from Blue Run, and I'll pull some bottles here, or coming from Obtanium, and I'll pull a bottle here so you can get a visualization of these. Compared to some single barrels that I've had of the light whiskey, ranging from 13 to 15 years, and even being finished in some ways. Those are cheaper, 60 to $80, and they can sometimes pack even more flavor than what I'm getting here. So that's where the value equation at 120 does hit me the wrong way. So then summarizing all this, loving the flavors, almost gave it a 80 on flavor, but we're sitting there right at a 78. Experience, it lost some points for its lack of complexity, particularly the mid palate, and then the value score is always going to hold this particular bottle back as well. So that all summarizes then in a final score of a 75 out of 100. And for context, of all the reviews that I have done personally since we started the scoring system in January 2023, this ranks 107 out of 142. So, in my mind, one of the lesser pours that I do have on my bar, even though it does have some highlights, it still doesn't stack up comparatively to other whiskeys that I have. So that's a summary there of the Penelope 15-year light whiskey. If you're looking to try a light whiskey for the first time, I do think there are other brands I would take a shot on first. Once again, highlighting the Obtanium or Blue Run as two brands that put out some good light whiskey at an affordable price. The flavors on this one, if you did buy it, I don't think you're going to be too upset with it. if you aren't looking for depth and all these technical scores that I'm bringing up, you saw what the score was on just the flavor. It bumps it up to a 78, almost an 80. So that makes it a decent pour there. So then it is going to be all a matter of the budget, paying that $120. Comparatively speaking, I think there's other things on the shelves that are more impressive at that dollar value. So comparatively, it doesn't stack up at that price range, and the price becomes its main black eye. So that concludes my thoughts on the Penelope 15-year. I'm going to go out on the back porch on this very sunny winter day and enjoy this with a cigar. So thank you for joining me today, whiskey friends. We'll catch you on the next whiskey review. Goodbye, everybody.
Jeff, just be friends with me. But you have these whiskey friends, and you say hello again. Oh, Jeffrey, you should just be friends with me. But you have these whiskey friends, and you say hello again. Oh, Jeffrey, you should just be friends with me. But you have these whiskey